This is Dante. He's a half-demon, half-human, half-angel demon hunter, and no, my maths isn't wrong, although it very often is. You may have heard of him since he's the star of long-running over-the-top romp Devil May Cry. Aside from being a badass who isn't scared of giant lava spiders or incredibly awful dialogue,
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
Dante and his adventures have proved pretty popular with gamers since he first arrived on the PS2 back in 2001. The action-packed slash-and-shoot combo-obsessed series is one of Capcom's most successful franchises and has shifted more copies than the likes of Half-Life or Mass Effect. But Andromeda was shit, so no one bought that anyway. Devil May Cry, otherwise known as DMC to the fans, has become synonymous with OTT action and vertical difficulty curves, as well as resurrecting the beat-em-up genre that all but died in the transition from 2D to 3D graphics. So we've got something to thank it for. Alongside his twin brother Virgil, blood relative Nero, and a host of scantily clad, poorly written female sidekicks, they so often are, Dante has to date averaged a pretty impressive 83 rating on Metacritic across multiple sequels and a reboot. But get your spades ready, because if you dig a little deeper, it soon becomes apparent that this is a franchise that really shouldn't exist at all. For a start, nobody asked for this game. Capcom never planned to make it back at the turn of the millennium, and it kinda just happened to them by accident. And well, they went with it. Plus, remember those Metacritic scores? Well, if we rewind and take another look, everything might not be what it seemed. This is a franchise that peaked with its first entry and has been chasing that dragon ever since. I mean, DMC2 makes Duke Nukem Forever look like a work of genius, and that was a big old pile of shit. Throw in a botched reboot and a decade-long hiatus for the main series, and you start to wonder, how is DMC still going? Well, it turns out the only thing Dante is better at than killing demons is dodging bullets. This is Game Changers, and this is the story of how Devil May Cry redefined a genre and survived against the odds. After what can only be described as a mental opening cutscene, the first thing you get to do in Devil May Cry 1 is explore a deserted castle. The initial atmosphere is creepy and ominous. It's a bit like Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil. Add in the camera angles, tense music, as well as locked doors, and those Resi comparisons become even stronger. The only things missing are a few zombies and a jump scare or two. This resemblance is more than just coincidence though, and that's because DMC started life as a prototype for Resident Evil 4. Resi had been a juggernaut for Capcom during the PS1 era, but producer Shinji Mikami, fearing the franchise was at risk of becoming stale, wanted to inject some fresh ideas into the series as it made the move to the PS2. Those fresh ideas were to be supplied by Hideki Kamiya, who was hired to direct RE4. Having already helmed RE2, as well as working on the original 1996 title, Kamiya had a lot of experience with the granddaddy of survival horror, but his plans for the fourth installment were centered on creating a cool and stylized action game, something pretty different from what Resident Evil had been. Instead, he opted to introduce a dynamic camera to help facilitate his more action-heavy focus, and this caused a lot of controversy back at Capcom. Marrying the cool, stylish action that Kamiya wanted with the tense survival horror roots of the Resident Evil series was proving impossible for the developers. According to Sawaki Takayasu, who worked as a modeler and designer on the project, Kamiya specifically told them not to use zombies in the scenario they were creating. Essentially, he was making a non-Resident Evil game, and it wasn't going unnoticed by those in charge at Capcom. Mikami might have wanted fresh ideas for the franchise, but he still wanted something that resembled a Resident Evil game, so he had no choice but to step in. But what was he going to do? Well, obviously he didn't cancel the work that had been done already, which in and of itself is a miracle. Instead, Mikami championed the new design, convincing his superiors that this bold new direction had a lot of potential, and that it was worth creating a fresh license based on Kamiya's work thus far. And that license became Devil May Cry. With the shackles completely off, Kamiya could now focus on making something more original, and for some reason, he turned to the 14th century epic poem The Divine Comedy as a source for inspiration. Gone were the mutant creatures, Umbrella Corporation and Tony Redgrave, and in came demons, evil underworld emperors, and of course, Dante. Not everything was completely thrown out though. The best examples are perhaps two of DMC's most iconic bosses, Phantom and Griffin, who both started life as enemies for Resi, but were tweaked to make them work in the new game. The genre-defining gameplay that sees you slaughter demons with massive swords or pepper them using guns with unlimited ammo was all about testing the player's ability to be stylish. You could kill enemies one at a time using simple button presses, or you could lace together acrobatic-looking combos using multiple moves moves that swept away hordes of enemies in one go. And if you really want to kick things off, you could bust out your devil trigger and morph into your OP demonic form. This combat system was considered a huge step forward and highly innovative, but even here Kamiya was actually taking inspiration from other sources. Part of the way players can extend their combos in DMC is through juggling enemies, a mechanic partially inspired by beat-em-up series Virtua Fighter and Tekken, but also by a bug in Onimusha Warlords. While playtesting Onimusha, Kamiya found that enemies could be kept in the air by repeatedly hitting them with the sword, so he included the same bug in DMC and added the ability to juggle enemies with guns just for good measure. Players in DMC are also given ranks for how stylish their combos are, the lowest being D for dull and the highest being S for, you guessed it, stylish. DMC's plot is pretty simple. Dante wants to avenge his dead family. Sure, there are some nice quips and interactions with some recurring bosses, but fundamentally you're not playing Devil May Cry because of the emotional rollercoaster it's taking you on. You're playing it because the gameplay is challenging, addictive and rewarding, and you feel awesome doing it. That's why it's no surprise that Kamiya continues his love of over-the-top action with Bayonetta, a batshit insane story about witches with clothing made of hair and guns in their heels. Ultimately, under the direction of Kamiya, the development team overseeing DMC, Team Little Devils, successfully completed work on Devil May Cry on the 23rd of August 2001 when it was released in Japan. It's fair to say that it did pretty well both critically and commercially, and it was friggin' brilliant. Upon release, it got a 34 out of 40 in Game Review Bible from Mitsu, and the likes of GameSpot, IGN and Game Informer gave it an almost perfect score. In fact, back in 2010, IGN put it at number 42 in their list of the 100 greatest PS2 games, ahead of the likes of Bully and Silent Hill 2. DMC also flew off shelves, shifting 600,000 units before the end of 2001 and racking up more than 3 million sales in its lifetime, including the HD Remaster Collection. Not bad for a game nobody actually pitched, and that can be described as a failed Resident Evil entry using a game-breaking Onimusha bug as its main combat mechanic. Naturally, a sequel soon followed. And by soon, I mean really soon, because DMC 2 was released just 17 months after the original, and according to the game's producer, this was a deliberate decision. Rushing out a sequel might have made sense for Capcom's bottom line, but that kind of quick turnaround would present a challenge for almost any development team, so it would probably make sense to use the same talent from the original game, including a director who just happens to be one of the best in the business, right? Well, not if you're Capcom. In fact, you do the exact opposite. You piss off the original development team by secretly launching the sequel behind their backs and bringing in a bunch of new people with limited experience. I mean, great job, guys. Welcome to Devil May Cry 2, a sequel so shit that if it was released today, it would almost certainly have killed the entire franchise. The problem for DMC 2 started before the first game had even been released in the West. While Hideki Kamiya was finishing localization for DMC 1, Capcom asked for his production notes, and when he asked why, as you would, he was told it was for a sequel that was already in development. It's fair to say that this came as a surprise, and one about as welcome as a cock slap to the face. To make matters worse, Capcom was restructuring, moving employees who mostly had experience in developing arcade fighting games over into their console division. Despite their limited experience, it was these employees who were given the responsibility of overseeing the development of the DMC sequel. The game's exec producer Noritaka Funamizu gave them free rein to do whatever they wanted. At this early stage, the team reached out to players of the first game, asking them for feedback on how the original title could have been improved. The results of this survey were clear. DMC 1 was too hard. Development thus focused on substantially lowering the difficulty of the game, as well as reducing the number of puzzles to make sure the overall experience was more dynamic in order to appeal to a broader audience. Other ideas being floated at the start of the design process were a little more questionable, including the notion that Dante might be replaced as the main protagonist. The star of DMC 2 at this point was going to be some random dude wearing a green jacket. Eventually, they came to their senses, but fast forward to mid-2002 and almost nothing on the game had been accomplished. With just 6 months to go before Devil May Cry 2's planned release, Capcom took the extraordinary decision of sacking the game's director. Even to this day, their identity remains a mystery. What we do know is they were replaced with Hideaki Itsuno. Trying to make big improvements to the game at this stage was basically impossible, and presumably on the verge of having a breakdown, Itsuno briefly considered ditching the DMC brand altogether, but this idea was rejected. Meanwhile, because one of the producers was not a fan of the wisecracking Dante that epitomized the series opener, his character had been fundamentally changed during the development process. Now he was older, tight-lipped, and way more boring. One of the key selling points from the first game, Dante's quips and personality had been gutted. To their credit, the development team did manage to make the game easier based on the player feedback. Only the problem was, they took this idea too far. Sure, the original might have been a bit on the hard side, but at least every fight felt like a real life or death challenge. It forced you to pay attention, use different combos, and get good at the game. The sequel is beyond easy. It's like a tutorial level that never actually ends. All enemies, including the bosses, barely move or attack. Even if they do somehow manage to land a blow, they do about as much damage as a flea bite. Add in an almost unending number of health pickups, and you've got a recipe for absolute boredom. In addition to the lack of any challenge whatsoever, the game was also roughly 9 times bigger than DMC1, filled with boring locations and uninspired enemies. I mean, don't even get me started on this. Oh look, a demonic helicopter. How terrifying. The end result, DMC2 was an absolute snooze fest. It wasn't exactly panned by critics, often gaining scores in the 5 to 7 out of 10 range, but given the universal acclaim of its predecessor, this was clearly a huge step backward for the series. If this had been the last we saw of Dante, nobody would have been surprised or possibly even cared. So why is the man in the red coat still alive and kicking? Well, it's all down to the fans who still went out and bought the game in droves. Since its release at the end of January 2003, DMC2 has racked up almost 3 million units sold, almost matching its predecessor. Money talks, and it whispered in Capcom's ear not to kill Dante. The development team who finished DMC2 were pleased to hear that a third entry in the series had been greenlit. They knew the second game wasn't good, and they wanted a shot to prove they can make a game worthy of the Devil May Cry name. Tanaka stayed on as producer, and Itsuno was looking forward to directing an entry from start to finish after his damage limitation job on the previous game. The aim for this third title was very clear: get back to what made DMC so addictive to play in the first place. That meant a focus on challenging gameplay, stylish combat, and making Dante a mouthy wise-ass rather than a miserable bastard who doesn't even want to be in his own game. Armed with a clear mission, a near-perfect template from DMC1, and a highly motivated team, Itsuno was able to steer Devil May Cry 3 through a largely trouble-free development, and the results spoke for themselves. This is the game that fans of the franchise considered the best, and it's easy to see why. Instead of a badass slashing his way through a story that could be written on the back of a beer mat, this is the first DMC game with any real characterization and story arc. The reintroduction of Virgil, Dante's brother, immediately raised the emotional stakes, especially given their drastically contrasting personalities and aims. One brother is the cocky hothead fighting to preserve his humanity, the other is effortlessly cool and collected and wants nothing more than to embrace his demonic side. It's red versus blue, good versus sort of evil, and when they team up to defeat the real big bad Arkham, it's a genuine moment of celebration. Cast your minds back to DMC1, where Hideki Kamiya was obsessed with making Dante cool and imbuing the game with oodles of stylish action. The DMC3 team took those twin ideas and turned them all the way up to 11. Perhaps it's because DMC3 is a prequel and Dante is younger and brasher than ever, but the action in this game is just outrageous. We've got Dante surfing around on rockets and playing a demonic guitar to take down baddies. Sure, it's absolutely insane, but it's fun. It's channeling the spirit of the Dante we love from DMC1 and pushing it to its limits. The back to basics mentality can also be seen in the emphasis on players achieving complex and difficult combos, with a star ranking going all the way up to triple S for stylish, to really challenge you to make the most of all your moves. The ability to switch weapons in the middle of fights also made it easier to keep your combos fresh. Of course, we already know that the game was a success upon release in 2005. That's all well and good, but you're probably thinking, how are you possibly going to say that DMC3 put the series at risk? I mean, it's a stone cold classic that 100% saved the series from extinction. But here's the thing about producing a work of genius: they take an awful lot of effort. We should know these 6 lists don't just grow on trees, you know. When production wrapped on DMC3 and the first murmurings of a 4th entry began to emerge at Capcom, most of the development team had nothing left to give. They'd achieved near perfection, so what was the point of doing another one? DMC3 cast a long shadow over the development team. Another sequel was coming, and the only problem was that nobody wanted to make it. That's usually a recipe for disaster, or at the very least it's a recipe for more of the same, with almost no innovation. Not mentioning any names, Final Fantasy. With the franchise's reputation restored, Capcom immediately raised the stakes for the 4th game in the series. This was going to be the very first entry on the next generation of consoles, the PS3 and the Xbox 360, which also meant DMC would, for the first time, not be a PlayStation exclusive. The rewards were clear. Get it right and Devil May Cry reaches a whole new audience on the Microsoft platform, and that was selling incredibly well in the US. But things didn't run smoothly. Itsuno was ready to step away from the project. In fact, it had always been his intention to leave DMC DMC after the third game. If it failed, he said he would have quit the industry altogether. If it succeeded, then he was ready to pass the baton on to someone else. Fortunately, Capcom weren't about to make the same mistakes as they did with DMC2. They ensured there were as few changes as possible in key development positions and persuaded Itsuno to stay. However, even with the key talent in place and approximately 80 people assigned to the project, nobody really knew where to take the series. Yurichiro Hiraki and Hiroyuki Nara, who were both involved in motion art and DMC4, both admit that the staff were very unmotivated. There was a sense that they were just wasting their time. The solution was, unthinkably, to replace Dante as the main protagonist. This might seem like a huge risk, but it offered the design team something new to sink their teeth into. Plus, from a business point of view, it made perfect sense to bring in a fresh lead character, someone who could introduce all those Xbox 360 players to the game without any of the baggage of having to explain Dante's backstory. So we got a new star at the heart of the game, Nero. Yet what sort of character would he be? The idea of trying to create someone who could surpass Dante in popularity galvanized the development team, but trying to shake off the wisecracking hero wasn't easy. Nero is not a Dante clone, but he looks very similar and has the same easygoing, laid-back air about him, just not to the same extent. He comes across as a bit of a watered-down Dante, with a few characteristics from Virgil thrown in for good measure, and he's nothing special. Where Nero shines, though, is in the game mechanics that were introduced especially for him. Of course, he wields a sword and has a revolver for the classic DMC slash-and-shoot feel, but this side of his gameplay is noticeably simplified to ease in new players. What saves him from being a discount Dante is his massive right arm. I mean, I bet he doesn't last 5 seconds with that thing. There you are then, running around, unloading kick-ass moves on demons in beautifully rendered next-gen environments until, you guessed it, a certain Mr. Dante shows up and suddenly takes over proceedings. It seems weird to say it, but as soon as DMC's most iconic character becomes the lead protagonist, you begin to get the feeling that all wasn't well with the development of the game. It all starts to seem a bit rushed. Dante's section of the game is poorly implemented. It's like the development team either ran out of ideas or they ran out of time. It's essentially a rehash of levels that you've played through as Nero. You already know the route, you've already fought the bosses, you've already learned how to counter their moves. Yawn. Let's not get it twisted. DMC4 doesn't become a shit game when Mission 12 begins and you play as Dante, it just becomes a slightly above average one. Sure, using Dante in combat is probably as good as it's ever been. His various combat styles from DMC3 are back and you can switch between them whenever you want. Plus, the sheer number of weapons you have equipped makes the combos as versatile as ever. But none of this changes the fact that Dante is playing through levels designed for Nero. Dante is already well established by this point in the series, but by forcing us to play as the veteran demon hunter for a third of the game, it severely curtails Nero's character development. Everything in DMC4 until then has been built around fleshing out the new protagonist, but that's put on hold in order to play with a character whose only relevance to the plot boils down to rescuing Nero. Look, maybe I'm speculating here, but it wouldn't be a surprise to learn that the development team on DMC4 had a whole Dante-specific scenario planned, with unique levels and a more fleshed out connection to the main story. Only they never got to implement it as they had to rush the game. Rumors online about DMC4 being hurried out by Capcom are fairly common. Some say the development time was halved or that most of the budget was spent on cutscenes, but there's no hard evidence to back those theories up. Unsurprisingly, interviews with those who worked on the project don't reveal such problems. However, there are some hints that things didn't go smoothly during the process of moving the title over to the PS3 and Xbox 360. It's important not to forget that DMC4 was the first in the series to use a next-gen game engine, the so-called MT framework, which had been used on other Capcom titles, Lost Planet and Dead Rising. And the development team were hoping to achieve a big step forward thanks to the improved hardware. However, Ikawa and lead motion manager Hiroyuki Nara both found the next generation consoles to be disappointing, and that making a game 3 times better wasn't all that easy. Perhaps the development team were too ambitious with their plans for the game, and faced with difficulties in using the new technology, had to roll back their ideas. The result being a good game, but one that felt rushed and unfinished compared to what it could have been. Then again, what do I know? DMC4 became the fastest selling entry in the series upon its release in 2008, with more than 2 million units sold in its first month, and sold 3 million plus units in its lifetime. Critically, it matched its predecessor in terms of ratings, and Nero received a warm welcome. So, mission accomplished, right? 2 good games in a row, healthy sales numbers, I mean, what's not to like? There's just one minor issue with that. We wouldn't get another entry into the main DMC Universe series for more than 10 years. Despite the cross-platform success of DMC4, the Devil May Cry series had still never obtained the mainstream success enjoyed by the likes of Call of Duty or Battlefield. Whenever Capcom had attempted to make the series more appealing to casual gamers with the likes of DMC's 2 and 4, it always resulted in an inferior product in comparison to the uncompromising DMC's 1 and 3. The overall effect created a franchise that lurched from hardcore and niche to overly simple and broad. It's hard to build momentum and become a AAA title when consumers don't know what to expect. There's a reason we keep buying essentially the same games over and over again. Hat tip to Ubisoft. Add in the fact that the DMC4 development team had struggled to motivate themselves to even create the game at all, and it soon becomes apparent that Devil May Cry was having a serious identity crisis. It was decided that the only way to save the series was with a completely new direction. It was reboot time. The starting point was a simple question: what would DMC be like if it was made in the UK or the USA? Creatively, Capcom were hoping the answer would be a game with a different cultural perspective and filled with fresh ideas. Financially, the theory was that a game made in the West would be more likely to appeal to a Western audience and leave Capcom swimming in Scrooge McDuck levels of money. This decision to give the next DMC a Western flavour coincided with a time where Capcom were outsourcing a lot of their properties to foreign developers. California-based Spark Unlimited handled Lost Planet 3. The questionable Bionic Commando reboot was developed by Swedish company Grin, and Dead Rising 2 was given to Canadian firm Blue Castle Games. So it wasn't exactly a surprise when Capcom USA suggested British developer Ninja Theory take on DMC. The direction Ninja Theory received from Capcom was simple: take the license, add in some Hollywood flair, and redefine the coolness at the heart of the DMC franchise. It's no surprise that Dante's redesign would be one of the most integral elements of the reboot, and the team at Ninja Theory seemed a little overwhelmed by the task at hand. Their initial designs were very similar to the Dante everyone knew and loved. Ironically, given the fan backlash that was just around the corner, it was Capcom who pushed Ninja Theory into making a radical departure with Dante's design. Out went the laid-back, playful Dante, and in came a character heavily influenced by Hollywood movies and punk. Dante 2.0's harder attitude was inspired by the likes of Fight Club and, in particular, Casino Royale, the movie that had successfully rebooted James Bond as a raw and flawed character, as opposed to the wisecracking hero of yesteryear. Britain's 1970s punk scene, which was characterized by angry youths sticking it to the establishment, also informed Hugh Dante's indignant attitude. Oh, and the iconic blonde hair was tossed out too, in an effort to make him seem more realistic to Western audiences. To be fair, Ninja Theory took up Capcom's challenge and redefined the cool that lay at the heart of the franchise. Gone was the effortless OTT vibe of the original series, and in came a cool that can be best described as edgy and, at the worst, try-hard. The big reveal was set for the 2010 Tokyo Game Show when the trailer for the game dropped. Would fans love the fresh take on a classic series? Well, no. On the whole, they absolutely hated it. Even though some elements of the new Dante were toned down, for example, the smoking aspect was removed and the character underwent some minor visual changes, the controversial hair and attitude stayed, so fans stayed angry. And in America, there was even a petition to get President Obama to prevent the game from being sold in stores. Upon release in 2013, the game was facing an uphill struggle to turn around opinions of hardcore fans and shift the negative headlines that dogged development. There was still hope though. The combat was praised for its fluidity and variety, while both the story and world design was cited as significant steps forward for the series. It achieved the same kind of critical scores as DMC 3 and 4. Yet the public remained unconvinced, and significant parts of the existing player base had been alienated by Dante 2.0, or were just not prepared to accept such a radical overhaul. Fan scores were noticeably harsher than those of critics, and sales were disappointing. Capcom initially hoped to sell 2 million copies by the end of its financial year, but just a month after its release, it cut forecasts by a whopping 800,000. DMC Devil May Cry may not have been a disaster of a game, but it was a disaster for the franchise. Not only was this yet another failed attempt at broadening the appeal of DMC, but a significant proportion of the loyal player base felt like they'd been betrayed. The reboot had done the opposite of what it was intended to do. Rather than breathe new life into the series, it had left it close to death. Despite all the units sold and accolades earned, it's a miracle Devil May Cry exists. Remember, this is a game born from a botched attempt at changing up the survival horror formula. Every subsequent release, with the exception of DMC 3, has been plagued with issues, usually relating to Capcom's obsession with trying to make the series more attractive to casual gamers. DMC 2 was a dumbed-down mess, and in the modern era would likely have killed the franchise stone dead. Such was its lack of quality. Number 4 was rushed and suffers from a lack of commitment to new ideas, while the reboot took itself too seriously and moved too far far away from what had made the series popular to begin with. For a franchise that has never quite achieved the broad appeal of a AAA title or the sales figures to match, it's incredible Capcom haven't given up on it. The 6-year wait between DMC5 and DMC Devil May Cry suggests that they might have thought about doing exactly that. It'll be interesting to see whether the 5th entry in the main series will finally hit that sweet spot between challenging gameplay and mass market sales. If it doesn't, then maybe DMC really won't exist for much longer.